Chapter 16. JJ walked Nate into the dark and empty warehouse. Nate's hands were bound loosely with rope as he shuffled in front of the Cajun. "Looks like we are early," Nate said, turning his head a bit to face Johnny. "Early is good, you get the best fishing spots." JJ smiled at Nate. Nate shook his head and looked forward, taking in his surroundings. "JJ, you better be right about this. I'm putting my life in your hands." Nate grumbled a bit. "Just trust me, Nate." JJ waved at the others as he brought Nate inside. When the two entered, they noticed a man in a suit waiting. "Oh good, looks like you were telling the truth. I don't know how you did it, Cajun, but good job." Kevin watched as Nate and JJ stopped in front of him. JJ walked on the side of Nate and leaned against him, placing his elbow on his shoulder. "What? You doubted I could survive the bull? You forget us country folk can survive." Nate looked at JJ's elbow and shook his head. "You thought you were pretty slick, Nate, helping that girl and going against the devils. Did you think Marina would just let you leave and live after all that? You were slick, I give you that." Kevin stepped out into the light. "O'Neill, should have known it was you. Aren't you on your last mess up? How many backsides did you have to kiss to keep that fancy job?" Nate pulled on his ropes. "You know, you almost got one over on us, Nate. Just one thing, well actually two. The first, you got too close to Paige, we knew you wouldn't be too far from her. The second, your war buddy, Rogers. He was your second downfall. The military has been having tabs on Jamal ever since he was discharged. All I had to do was peek in those files." Kevin continued to ramble on and JJ was getting antsy. The Cajun sighed and stood up straight. "Mace, are you all gonna shoot da shit all day?" JJ asked. Kevin made a face at JJ's comment. "Shoot da shit." JJ nodded. "Yes, shoot da shit, play around talking." Kevin lifted a brow and looked at Nate. "Don't look at me, I don't speak Cajun onyx." Nathaniel informed Kevin of his lack of knowledge on JJ's slang. JJ's face dropped, and he glared at Nate. This was part of the plan. Get as much info out of Kevin as possible before killing him. JJ had to convince Kevin he was still on his side. "Look, I brought him in and told him everything. He is with us, if you know what I mean." JJ whispered and looked over at Kevin. He wanted Kevin to admit he had been playing JJ this whole time. Kevin's face curved into a smile. "Sorry, it is not that easy." Kevin looked at JJ and Nate sideways as four men in suits came out of the dark. Two red dots shone on Nate's and JJ's forehead. JJ crossed his eyes trying to look at the dot. "Now this is some bull." JJ looked at Nate, just realizing what he said. "I don't mean you," but JJ glanced back at Kevin with an angry stare. JJ knew Kevin was playing him from the start. Now he was going to hear it straight from the horse's mouth. Nate shook his head in aggravation. "JJ, you should have never trusted to take up with the CIA or O'Neill. They're both two-faced." Nate looked at the other suits, then to Kevin. "The CIA are working with the cartel and the so set up and coming crime organization. He is managing it, I hear. But I'm sure Kevin will find some way to screw this up. It's what he's good at. Got one of his bosses, Mr. Alvarez, locked up and now wants to kill everyone else, including you, his informant. Anything to save himself and take down Marina by himself. Marina won't work with the CIA and he knows it. She is very different than her father, isn't she? Another loose end he needs to clean up along with both of us. He uses people and he used you." JJ Nate laughed. "You used me to be your inside man, huh? To be a backup plan in case things went sideways." JJ glared at Kevin. "In case you messed up and the CIA came for you, you could blame it on me." "Sort of, maybe half the truth," Kevin admitted. "Never really worked with Kevin, but I knew he was CIA, and so that meant to stick up his rear." Nate spat on the ground. "Ha. Ha. Funny, I'm not the one looking like I work at 7 to 11 right now." Kevin made a snarky remark at Nate. "Now that is racist. Not all Indian people work at a 7 to 11 saying, want to buy a Slurpee?" JJ said the last part in an Indian accent. Nate closed his eyes as if he could fathom him. Kevin, we had a deal. I work with you and you help me bring my brother's killer to justice. JJ pointed at Kevin. You think your brother is worth more than a government in this operation? One little hiccup's life worth more than that? Ha. Do you really think that? I wanted you in the business to help keep tabs on everyone. To be my little errand boy and help the merge of the CIA and cartel business along with everyone else. To be my ears and eyes, pest control you could say. Take out the others and control the main drug cartel. Everything was going smooth. Both parties on board, and then Nate had to rush in like a knight in shining armor and mess that all up. Over some girl. That is not you, Nate. I was shocked. I knew JJ would screw himself up, but you. Never would have thought. Kevin grinned and watched the two in front of him become more upset. Now that Mr. Alvarez is locked up, Marina is more worried about you two than the plan and the organization. The beginning stages are vital, and we cannot lose focus. Kevin raised his voice at the two. JJ stood with his fist balled glaring at Kevin, as Nate tried to wiggle out of his binds. Paige arrived at the dark, empty warehouse, at least that's what she thought. She noticed a couple guys coming in the rear and dodged out of sight. This had to be the right place. Paige noticed the fire escape and exit door up top, so she proceeded to climb the steel steps and entered silently. As she walked in, a familiar voice struck her ears, and she knew she was in the right place. Paige crept to the end of the railing and peeked down. Her eyes widened when she saw Nate. The man standing on the side of Nathaniel she didn't know, but the men surrounding them looked like government. Paige noticed the gunman who pointed the rifle at Nate, a couple feet from her. Paige took a deep breath before making her way towards him. Walking up behind the gunman, Paige knocked him out using the butt of her own gun. She quickly grabbed the gun and aimed it at Nate, as to not give suspicion. For a moment the dot sat on Nate, but Paige then let her aim and the red dot slowly moved to the back of the other man that stood in front of Nate. JJ noticed the dot move from Nate's forehead to Kevin's. Kevin turned to face where his gunman was and squinted to see what was going on. Now, who's the Indian? JJ asked as he slipped his hand in his pocket. He couldn't believe he put his trust in this man. After everything he did for Kevin and that vile group, Kevin was going to screw him over. All because JJ was a loose end for the government. Kevin growled and turned to face Nate and JJ, but it was too late. Nate dropped his ropes and charged one of the suits with guns. JJ laughed maniacally and took out a knife and charged a gunman. Bullets flew as the men started firing. Kevin dodged and made his way behind a pillar, pulling out his own gun. Paige fired at the other gunman across the warehouse that was on the same level as her. She struck him, and he fell over the railing. Kevin tried to shoot Nate, as Nate struggled with another thug for his gun. JJ stabbed the other man in Kevin's group, and used the thug's own hand to shoot the other guy Nate was struggling with. It was all over in mere seconds. Paige then ran down the stairs and towards Nate. "What are you doing here?" Nathaniel demanded in anger. "Saving your butt, obviously." Paige snapped back as she tossed the empty rifle to the ground. JJ cleaned his knife on his black pants and stuck it back in his pocket. "Who's this?" JJ asked Nathaniel. Nate snapped his body around and raised his gun at JJ. Hey. Look, we on the same team. I was telling you the truth. It isn't my fault Kevin screwed me over. I warned you he was going to. You owe me, Nate, and I intend on taking out Marina. She's after you too, so wouldn't it be in both our best interest to work together?" JJ said, raising his hands. "You shouldn't be here. You should." Nate was still talking to Paige, but she cut him off. "Where should I be?" "Behind a desk. Doing my nails while you get killed." Nate snapped his head around to look at her. "Yes, that is exactly what you should be doing. I helped you get your company back. You need to stay out all of this." His words spat back angrily at her. The whole time they were fussing, JJ's eyes went back and forth from each of them. "Excuse me if the great hitman needed help. You were just too proud to ask for it, even though I did just save your life." Nate went to say something back as he lowered his gun. He took a couple steps closer towards her to get in her face, but Kevin interrupted him. Just the person I needed. He spoke from around the pillar. Great. This guy is still alive. JJ added in. See why I didn't want you here. Kevin wants you, more than me. Nate almost whispered towards Paige. Now that Ms. Welsh is here, why don't you do me the honor and tell me where that software is? Huh. Save me a lot of time and men. Kevin asked as Paige's face twisted a bit. They still want the software. I don't even know. Nate shushed her. Don't shush me. She snapped back. Okay, you two lovebirds, can we get out of here before more of his guys come? JJ said, making a face. JJ knew Kevin didn't need him anymore, and just wanted Paige's company's software. Most likely for government use. Nate nodded towards JJ and grabbed Paige's arm, but she pulled away from him. Oh, my men. They're already here. Kevin added, and holding his gun up and stepping around the pillar, firing at the three of them. Nate grabbed Paige again and ran towards the exit, almost dragging her. JJ followed behind as a couple more men came storming the building. Great, I get stuck with these two. JJ complained as he ran behind them. I can't believe you came here, so stupid. Nate finally let go of her when she ran alongside of him. Yeah. I'm so stupid, I just saved your life. Paige fussed back. I had it under control, he spat back. Yeah, us surrounded was under control. JJ added. Nate and Paige turned and both screamed for him to shut up. The trio finally made it outside, but still dodged bullets. JJ branched off from them and ran to the bad guys' SUVs and cars. Paige stopped and watched JJ trying to figure out where he was going. Don't worry about him, let's go. Nate went to grab her arm again. If you grab me one more time, Nathaniel, I swear. But Paige was cut off by JJ running back towards them, and then past them. Come on, let's go. In my truck here, and towards the black lifted truck. JJ hopped in on the driver's side and started it up. Paige started to go to her car, but JJ stuck his head out. Come on, he screamed. JJ is right, your car is probably bugged with GPS. Paige rolled her eyes and ran to JJ's massive truck. It took her a moment to hop up into it. Nate followed behind and slammed the door shut. Couldn't you pick a less conspicuous vehicle? Nate complained as he buckled his seatbelt. Always complaining, you are worse than a woman. JJ took off down the road. The men jumped into the SUV and peeled out to follow them. Paige turned around in the middle of the two males and watched. Can this truck outrun them? Paige asked and looked at Nate. Nate's face was twisted in anger. He couldn't believe he was in this stupid truck. I don't have to outrun them. JJ turned and smiled at Paige. Why? Paige asked, looking at Nate and JJ clueless. 'Cause I'm the bomb, like tick-tick. JJ dug out a small remote and pressed a button. When he did, the cars following them exploded. Paige jumped and almost fell backwards. What the? She looked back at the flaming cars and then to JJ. JJ smiled and turned on the radio. AC/DC blared, and he sang along with it. 'Cause I'm TNTM dynamite. Paige's eyes went large at his weird ways. She then looked at Nate, who was brooding beside her. He's a show-off. Just because he knows how to use C4 now. You're welcome, by the way. Nate muttered. Paige turned and sat down, trying to take in everything that just happened. JJ lowered his radio. So where to? He asked. We need to lay low. Somewhere that no one will find us, at least for a little while. Give me time to think. Nate said as he kept his eyes on the road ahead. All right, the swamp it is. JJ smiled and hummed and drove along. Swamp? What swamp? There are no swamps in Houston. Paige asked, looking at Nate. No, the swamp is a little place along the bayou where I live. It is way off the radar. JJ explained. You sure that's a good idea? Paige turned and asked Nate. Why ask me? You didn't listen to what I had to say before. He grumbled. You know what, Nate? Paige went to go off on him again, but JJ turned up his music and sang along with it. The Cajun didn't want to hear the argument. Dark desert highway, cool wind in my hair, JJ sang as Paige crossed her arms and sat back in the middle, brooding along with Nate. Kevin walked out of the warehouse, cursing as he took out his phone. The agent tried to call his men, but they didn't answer. A few more obscenities left his mouth as he called his second-in-command Laura. Laura was the undercover receptionist in William Green's business, keeping tabs on him, but since William was locked up, Kevin sent her over to Europe to look for Nick, the Ukraine in jail's brother. Kevin was pissed that JJ got away, not only with Nate, but also with Paige. Kevin could have taken care of 3 problems at once, but the trio got away. Kevin knew he was screwed on both ends, CIA and Marina's cartel, if he didn't get the Cajun. JJ knew too much, and he should have gotten rid of him years ago. Kevin made a phone call to his CIA partner Laura Taylor, who was also in on the whole cartel and rebel deal. Agent Taylor, we have a problem. The Cajun, Nate and the Welsh girl got away. I need you to bring in rebels quickly to help track them down and get rid of them before they blab to anyone. Kevin was almost out of breath as he jogged down the sidewalk to his car. He needed to get out of there and fast. I'm counting on you, Laura. Kevin sighed as he got into the driver's seat. I will get it done, Laura told her boss before hanging up. She ran a hand over her blonde hair, trying to remain calm and do the job Kevin appointed her to. She knew the importance in finishing up this case to not only him but the department. Nicole sat across from the blonde CIA agent in the living room of a small apartment. Was that O'Neill, the man who helped my brother out of prison? Nicole asked. Laura nodded and tucked her cell phone away. Nicole, Kevin as well as Marina, need your help on a matter. We released your brother in good faith that your comrades are still on the same page and the same goal as everyone else, she asked. Yes. World domination, yada yada. We are on board. The Lost Coin, Chapter 17, Europe. Nicole sat across from Laura, the blonde CIA agent in the living room of a small apartment. It was low light and barely had anything inside of it, only a small couch, chairs and a coffee table. You could tell the place was barely lived in. Nicole rested his arms on the chair's armrest and focused his eyes over at the female agent. His shoulder-length brown hair was slicked back and his legs crossed in a proper manner. Nicole studied Laura as she studied him back just as intently. His thoughts were interrupted by the loud bang that came from behind him. Nicole sat up and turned to look behind him. He cursed in Russian as the other taller man walked from around the other side of the wall. Don't you curse at me, Nick. I'm starving and you never have anything to eat in here. The tall man came walking and towered over Nicole's chair. Vito, you see me talking to this nice agent. Why don't you just go down into town and grab us something to eat? Nick huffed and sat up straight in his chair, his eyes never leaving the agent. Laura looked up at Vito and then down to Nicole. Her face was straight and serious. She was there on behalf of Kevin, her boss. Kevin needed Mikhailov's brother, Nicole, to track down and take out Nathaniel. Orders from Marina, now the boss of the Alvarez cartel. Vito held out his hand and Nick raised a brow. Don't look at me like that, you know I'm broke. He wiggled his finger for Nick to give him money. He sighed loudly and dug into his back pocket. The Ukraine took his wallet out and stuffed money into Vito's hand. Now go, get out my face. Vito wiggled his eyebrows and nodded his head while walking out. Vito was well over 6'5", so the giant had to put his head down a bit as he exited the doorway. I'm sorry about that, Miss Taylor. He is a bit rude sometimes, but he is loyal and my dearest friend. Nick shoved his wallet back into his pocket and crossed his legs again. Now, where were we? Yes, your commander, Agent O'Neill and his boss, MS. Alvarez need me. He spoke softly as he continued to study the woman. She sat up straight and stiff with her hands in her lap. Yes, that is exactly right, Mr. Borakov. She nodded. Agent O'Neill will get your brother released, while Ms. Alvarez will help fund this expedition. Her father as well as your father's alliance still stand. She kept her eyes on his. We need that software and the two dead at all costs, she added. All costs. Nick smirked a bit as he mimicked her last words, but in a more relaxed tone. Very well, I am sure Vito will be more than pleased to hear he is aiding the same organization that his sister was part of, Violet, or Vespa to most. Much is highly spoken of the Seven Devils, well, more like Four Devils now. He hissed a bit. So, you are on board with us then? Your brother is being released as we speak, as well as a shipment of cash and drugs for you to dispense for Ms. Alvarez. I am sitting in for my partner until he arrives. Laura continued to explain to Nicole. Nick nodded and held a hand out to shake on it. We have a deal. Nick gave a devilish grin as she shook his hand firmly. Our family and the Alvarez cartel have had a great alliance. Both ends have made substantial amounts of money in political gain. I will not allow this small hiccup to interfere with a good thing. My father's deal with the Alvarez family stands. Nick reassured the CIA agent that sat in front of him. Louisiana. The ride was loud with Johnny's rock music, but Paige and Nate didn't speak once to one another. JJ turned down the music as he exited off of the highway, onto a back road. The green sign read New Iberia 10 miles. Paige had never been out in the country like this. The buildings soon turned into trees, grass and fields of sugarcane. She lived all her life in the city, yet Texas did have country, but she never went. She was always in the city even when she would travel with her father when she was young. The next brown sign said Cypress Point State Park 10 miles. Sorry to drag you in on all this mess, miss, but the same people I am after are after you and Nate, and well, I'm sure Kevin will lie and say I jumped ship, when the whole time it was his idea to go undercover. JJ growled, trying to explain everything to the blonde that sat next to him. Should have never trusted him. His Sean voice said. For once, I agree. His demon said. Paige just watched wide-eyed as JJ talked to himself. Don't pay him any mind. He's a little. Nate moved his finger around in circles by his head to signal crazy. JJ noticed Nate whispering and making signals. Nate, I am not crazy. JJ growled a bit while Nate just made sarcastic wide eyes, and rolling them before sitting back against the seat. He was none too happy to be stuck in this situation with JJ. Nor was he happy that Paige was dragged into it again. The girl had been through enough in the past year, and Nate tried his best to keep her out of further involvement. Look, if we are going to work together, we need to get along. Okay, Paige fussed at both of them. She wasn't happy about being forced back into danger, but something she learned from past mishaps is that it was better to work together and be on the same page with each other. JJ was a bit more out there and reckless than Nate. Nate being more calculating, his every move planned out, so she understood why the two clashed. No one really did get along with Nate, not even herself when they first met. And the very people you are after are responsible for not only your brother's death, my father's death, but for worldwide crime. Many other families are being torn apart because of them, and they need to be shut down. Paige tried to calm the situation with logic. She was looking at the bigger picture instead of the minor setback. We need to collect ourselves and think about our next move, not argue with each other. She continued to push her point across. The two males agreed with her and kept their mouths shut. The rest of the ride was dead silent. Chapter 18. JJ reached the end of the dirt road where an old house sat. It was surrounded by cypress and pecan trees, while a bayou ran along the side of it. It had a dock with an old boat sitting in the brown water, swaying in the breeze. The house itself was a nice size. The only thing wrong with it was, it just needed a new paint job. The gray paint was flaked on the wooden siding from the years of weather and sun. Home sweet home. JJ belted out as he hopped down from the driver's side of the truck. Suddenly, around the corner of the wraparound porch, a huge German shepherd came bolting and barking. Paige noticed the dog as she was getting out and quickly jumped back in the truck. Nate, ever on guard, just watched JJ take off running as the dog chased him. The Cajun went once around the house, and then dropped and rolled in the grass. The dog then jumped on top of him. It turned out that the dog was not savage at all. Not in the least bit, but the way JJ made it seemed running like an idiot screaming, gave Paige a scare. The dog licked his face like crazy, and JJ gripped his fur wrestling it about. It's okay. This is my partner, Sasquatch. JJ noticed the two standing concerned beside his truck. Mama was watching him from Yappa. He made a face at the dog. The dog passed major gas and JJ gagged. Paige finally opened the door and hopped out when she noticed it was safe. He got the frotch today. Mama must have been feeding you poor cracklings, huh? JJ got up holding his nose. The what? Paige asked, looking over towards Nate with a confused face. I stopped asking a long time ago. Nate looked down at Paige, rolling his eyes. The frotch, like the bubble guts, JJ said, walking over to them. He then turned to look at the house, then them. It ain't much, but it was my mama's. She gave it to me and Sean when she passed. His face kinda dropped. His smile turned to a straight face when he mentioned Sean. Who is Sean? Paige asked in a soft voice. JJ looked down and then over at her. He was my brother. The one that was murdered by the cartel. He's the whole reason for me joining the Devils and all, remember? JJ looked at her and Nate both. Oh, I'm sorry. Paige didn't know what else to say. It's okay, come on, I'll cook you all up something. He waved for them to follow him as he began singing like always. It's gonna take a lot to take me away from you. There's nothing that 100 men or more could ever do. I bless the rains down in Africa. Gonna take some time to do the things we never had. Nate, still quiet, followed JJ up the 4 steps onto the porch. Paige followed behind Nate, and so did the dog. Sasquatch ran up to the door and watched as JJ unlocked it. As soon as the door opened, the happy pup ran in straight to his bed, grabbing his raccoon chew toy. JJ walked in and headed straight to the kitchen. The dining area was to the left with a small table, and the kitchen was directly on the side of it. You could tell the house had been locked up a while. It kinda smelled like a mix between an old lady's home and wet, humid wood. Paige closed the door behind her and stood by Nathaniel. JJ dug in the fridge for something to cook. Make yourself at home. It's a 3-bed, 2-bathroom house, so there's plenty of room. The living room is in there and the hall leads to the rooms. The guest bathroom, it's at the beginning of the hall. Nate nodded and went to look for it, while Paige looked around at the various pictures that hung up along the wall. The wood paneling held quite a few things. A Billy Bass fish, a Cajun prayer plaque, and a picture of JJ with another blonde man, both in police uniforms, holding on to an older woman. JJ noticed her looking at the pictures. That's my mom and brother Sean, he said, opening a beer. Sean had just graduated from the academy. He was behind a few years than me. He started digging in the cabinets, making all kinds of noise. So, you were a cop? Paige inquired, setting the picture back on the wall. Yup, sheriff deputy, for 10 years. JJ sat a big silver pot on the stove as he spoke. Have you ever had gumbo? He asked with a smile as he sipped his Miller Lite. Oh, I'm sorry, you want one? JJ held up his beer. Paige looked up at the drink as it dangled in his hands. I have water too. He pointed to the white fridge. It was filled with magnets of critters like raccoons, alligators, and fish. It also had pictures of what looked like him and his brother along with other family members. I'll take a water, please, she asked shyly. JJ opened the fridge and grabbed her a bottle. He then walked it over to Paige, who was now sitting at the table. JJ still had his jumpsuit arms tight around his waist, and his black shirt was full of grass from where he was rolling with the dog. Paige took the bottle with a smile and thanked him. You can sit in the living room, if you'd like. Make yourself comfortable and at home, he said, walking back to dig out some more things. She nodded. It's fine, thank you. Paige thanked him for the water and unscrewed the cap. JJ's home was small compared to hers, but she adored it. Small and simple, as well as homey and inviting. Paige sipped her water as she watched JJ turn the sink water on and start to clean chicken. The dog finally came walking by her and sat. Paige froze, not knowing what to do at first. The dog then laid his head on Paige's knee and gave her big eyes. Paige sat her water down and slowly reached down to let the dog smell her hand. "Oh, I see Saz likes you. You can pet him, he won't bite." JJ turned and started putting oil and flour in the pot, turning on the flame while humming to himself. Paige smiled and slowly patted the dog's head. She stopped and the dog licked her, wanting more attention. Paige thought JJ was pretty calm after the whole situation they were just in. It did help that they had a 4-hour drive to cool off, but the Cajun was a lot different than the bull. JJ was just glad to be home and have Nate on his side. He also enjoyed the fact that Paige was willing to help as well. She had been through a lot just like JJ, so he knew he could trust her. He trusted Nate, and Nate trusted her. Enough said. JJ, for some reason, always trusted Nathaniel more than he ever trusted Kevin. The bull was always upfront with you. JJ and Nate had been through a lot in the cartel's employment, and Nate was an honorable man. The Cajun was upset about the past 5 years. Undercover for Kevin had been almost for nothing, but he hit it well. It was a huge speed bump, but hopefully soon they could get back on track. Meanwhile, Nate used the bathroom and washed his hands. He dried them on the towel and walked back out and towards the kitchen. The bull looked over to JJ, who was cutting up onions and sliding them into the pot. He then turned to see Paige smiling and petting the dog, as if nothing ever happened. Nathaniel had never seen Paige smile like that before. The whole time he was with her in the past, she did show various emotions, but never happiness. Nathaniel walked over to the table and sat across from her. Still remaining silent, Nate took out his phone and looked to see if anyone called. Paige noticed Nate enter the room and her smile dropped a little. She was still mad at him. The dog walked over and laid in front of the fridge, on top of the camo rug, giving Paige no choice but to acknowledge Nate's presence. JJ stirred the steaming concoction that he had going on, then turned on the vent to get some of the smoke out. Paige turned to face Nate and placed her feet under the table. Their eyes met for a moment, but Paige glanced down quickly to avoid conversation. The table had a stack of mail that gathered on the end. Paige looked up and noticed Nate too busy in his phone to even notice her, so curiosity got the best of her. Paige sort of peeked through the stack. A couple gun and hunting magazines, flyers, and then she noticed the Iberia Parish Sheriff envelope. She quickly put the stack down when she heard JJ move. She put her elbow on the stack and watched JJ as if she wasn't doing anything. JJ poured water into the pot, slowly. He then put the chicken and sausage in it, giving it all a good stir. JJ then grabbed his beer and came to sit in the other chair, between Nate and Paige. He sipped his beer and looked over at the silent Nate. "So everything came out all right?" he asked as he sat his other hand on his knee. Nate glanced up from his phone, gave JJ a go-to-hell look, and then looked back at his phone. JJ rolled his eyes as he sat his beer down and looked over at Paige. "So how did you get mixed up with this fellow?" he asked to break the awkward silence. Paige thought JJ was something else. 1 minute JJ has Nate held hostage, and now they were in his house, and he was cooking for them. "I had hired him to help me find my father's killer." JJ nodded and listened. "And how did that work out for you?" he asked, rotating his can of beer. "It worked," Nate said in a low, gruff tone, keeping his eyes on the phone. Paige looked over at Nathaniel, then JJ. "I got my company back from the man responsible for the death of my father, the very same one who tried to steal it, and he went to jail." Paige explained. "I noticed Nate taught you a couple things." Like shooting, JJ brought the can back to his lips and took a long sip. The Cajun avoided glancing at the bronze, brooding bull beside him. Paige nodded as she looked over at Nate, who now put his phone away and proceeded to glare at JJ. "I haven't heard anything from Rogers." Nate finally spoke up. "I hope he's okay." Paige added. "How did you know where I was?" Nate asked her. "After the meeting with your friend, Rogers, they sent someone after me, in my apartment. I got a hold of his phone." Paige explained to Nate as she glared at him. Her tone was flat, and she really didn't want to start another fight. And where is the guy now? Nate asked. He's still laying in my apartment. Paige spoke without missing a beat. JJ watched both of them exchange words for a moment, and then got up to go check the food. Seems Natey boy taught you more than just how to shoot, JJ said, stirring the pot. Yeah, I guess so. Paige eased up her tone as she let her hand lay over the magazines. The dog jumped and started sniffing his rear. Oh good God, JJ said, covering his nose with his arm. The smell wafted over to the others, and Paige's face dropped. Oh my, she said, covering her nose and mouth with clasped hands. JJ, what is wrong with that dog? Nate's face wrinkled as he looked at the dog licking his rear. He has a rot gut. SAS, stop. JJ walked over and poked him with his boot. The dog jumped and walked back to his bed, embarrassed. JJ grabbed some men's cologne and started spraying all over. That's just making it worse, Nate said, watching him. Sorry, blame my mama. JJ walked back over to the food and covered it. He then took out a smaller pot and filled it with rice and water. The three sat and ate in silence, staring only at their bowls. It was a bit awkward and Paige needed to break the silence. This is really good, Johnny, she said, sipping the broth with her spoon. Thank you. It is my mama's recipe. She always made a roux, never bought from the store. He smiled at her as he took a sip from his beer. Paige didn't know what he was talking about, but she nodded and smiled. Her eyes glanced at Nate before they went back to her bowl. I think we should head to bed early. We have a lot of planning tomorrow. Nate finally spoke up. Always ordering, she swore he didn't know what a normal conversation was. Yeah, it's been a crazy day, JJ said, finishing his food and brought his bowl to the sink. JJ then began picking up the food as Sasquatch finally came out of his bed. The dog sat beside Paige again, and for some reason, the dog took a liking to her. She smiled down at him and patted his head. Nate picked up his bowl and brought it in the kitchen. He then placed it in the sink as JJ washed. I don't know how long we can stay here, they probably already tracked us. Nathaniel spoke in almost a whisper so Paige wouldn't hear. JJ nodded. I know, but we don't even have a play on how to deal with all this. This whole time, I thought Kevin was taking care of everything. Boy, was I wrong about him. JJ rinsed off the bowl and sat it in the other side the sink. That's what you get for trusting him. He is government. Should have known, someone in the CIA helping the cartel and trying to help you. They are all two-faced. You should know to never trust them. Nate watched JJ a bit. JJ knew Nate was right. I know, but I was desperate, okay. I was on the run and my back was against the wall. Kevin was my only option at the time. I was able to take out some of them little by little, you know. Blaming it on the other gangs, but my main target was Marina and her father. They were the main ones responsible for my brother's death, JJ explained. Well, Marina's father is in jail, and for a long time. Our concern is not only Marina, but Kevin and that little Russian or Ukraine group. Whatever they are, I'm sure they are not happy about me killing Vespa. Nate frowned a bit as he remembered the incident. Yes, so you see we are both in this together. Johnny turned the sink off and wiped his hands. Paige knew they were most likely talking about her. She shook her head and brought her bowl over to them and placed it in the sink, purposely cutting between them. I'm going to bed. She gave Nate evil eyes before turning and walking towards the back of the house. The dog followed her into the room and hopped on the bed. Paige didn't mind at all. She wanted the comfort, and knew she wasn't going to get it from any of those two idiots. She hopped into the bed and wrapped her arm around Sasquatch. The dog could tell she was upset, and he only knew her for a couple hours. She stroked his fur and tried to stay sane and not have a breakdown. Her life was never going to be the same, not as long as that software disk was floating around. She had to find it and destroy it, but where would she even begin to look for it? It was always some kind of mission, or killer after her, or shifty people using her. Will I ever get a normal life again? She asked the dog. The dog licked her face a bit. Paige sighed deeply and closed her eyes. She then began to pray, something she did often. Get some sleep, Nate. We can figure this out tomorrow. JJ patted Nate's shoulder and walked to his own room. He closed the door quietly and shuffled over to his bed. He plopped down, face first, and screamed into the camo comforter. He had held himself together all day. Now behind closed doors, he let his anger and hurt out. JJ finished his little tantrum and grabbed the bottle of pills on the bedside table. They would drown out his voices and let him sleep. Chapter 19. The next morning, Paige woke to a buzzing on her cell phone. The dog jumped off of the bed and opened the door, leaving her alone in the room. She took her phone out and looked at it with squinted eyes. It was around 6 in the morning, and the sun was just beginning to come out. Paige let out a sigh and pulled the covers off her. She then tried to figure out why her phone had gone off. While searching, she found she had an email. It was weird because the service was cutting in and out so bad, and no one had tried to contact her before. The messy-haired blonde got up and walked outside to see if she could get better reception. JJ laid in his bed silently staring up at the ceiling. He hadn't slept much that night. Around 3 a.m., the voices woke and kept him up, whispering to him and making him a bit paranoid. What if Nate would betray him? What if he was doing all this for nothing? 5 years of cutting a bloody path through criminals for criminals, he was far from the same person he used to be. The Cajun had changed, and not for the better. Normal people mourned and tried to move on, and JJ joined a cartel. The very cartel that was responsible for his brother's death, that weighed heavy on a man. His sins were getting to him and weighing him down. Having to serve and do for the very people who turned his life to this. JJ, finally broken, decided to do things himself. No more relying on people. It seemed as if he was helping Paige, but deep down he was selfish and only doing it to get closer to Kevin. He knew they were going to come after them all now, and Kevin for sure was going to spill the beans on JJ, making it out that he was the bad guy to Marina. What did it matter? They really were the enemy. JJ turned over and let out a sigh as he rubbed his dark circles under his eyes. The house was quiet as Paige crept through it. Sasquatch waited by the door to be let out, so Paige opened the screen door. Stepping out onto the porch, Paige's face was buried in her phone as the dog ran past her towards the yard. It was pretty warm and humid for this early in the morning. She walked around the porch looking for service, raising the phone up and side to side. Her attention was drawn from the phone and now to the dog barking like crazy. Paige saw him in the grass, barking towards the porch where she stood. "What saws?" she asked and looked all over, then her eyes caught it. A 3-foot alligator laid a couple feet from her. Paige let out a scream and jumped up on the porch railing. The dog barked like crazy as the gator hissed with his jaw ajar. JJ came flying out the house in just his boxers and white rubber boots. When he noticed no one was trying to shoot up the place, he calmed down a bit. "All right," JJ yelled at Saws. He wiped the sleep from his eyes and walked closer to Paige, his black hair all a mess and his eyes squinting as if he had just woken up. His body was a pale color and lean but toned, his boxers sagging on his small hips. "You okay?" he asked Paige as he wiped his hand down his scruffy short facial hair. Paige's eyes wide, not taking them off of the gator. Every now and then she would glance up at him. JJ waited for Paige to tell him why she was screaming like a banshee. His face was contorted as his long arms rested at his side. Paige couldn't believe he was this calm. She said nothing but pointed at the gator. JJ turned and looked at the alligator and smiled a bit. "I know, they come up here sometimes from the bayou." He walked to the other end of the porch and dug in a toolbox. JJ tried not to laugh. It tickled him to know she was scared and freaking out. He then grabbed the duct tape and walked back over towards the gator. Paige watched him, speechless. She was not used to outdoorsy things. The gator hissed and turned the other way to try and escape. JJ jumped on top of it and closed the mouth shut and duct taped the mouth. Paige's jaw dropped to the whole scene. Suddenly, Nate came running out with a gun in hand. His pants on sloppy and his shirt unbuttoned. He looked at Paige, then at the almost naked JJ wrestling with the alligator. Nate sighed in relief and lowered his gun. Really? Nate shook his head at JJ. JJ got up and picked up the gator. The gator's tail flopping all over, smacking him in the face almost. What are you going to do with it? Paige asked. I'm going to drive down a ways and put it back in the bayou. It's too small to legally kill and cook. Look at me still being a cop. Once one, always one. He talked to himself as he walked down the steps and towards his truck. The dog barked and snapped at the gator, while JJ yelled at him to stop. Saz kept jumping up and clawing JJ, so JJ had to put his boot on the dog's chest and push him away. Come on, Sasquatch, stop, he yelled as he tried to put the wiggling gator in the cab of his truck. He succeeded just barely, and had to grab his boxers to keep them from falling off due to the dog's excitement. The dog continued to bark and jump up on the truck, his nails making a screeching noise as they scraped the metal. JJ grew pissed and yanked his collar, dragging the dog with him away from the truck. Crazy mutt scratching my paint. Stop it. He growled as he was a bit upset now. Paige hopped down off of the railing, her phone still death gripped in her hands. Nate tucked his gun back into his pants and looked over at Paige. He was a bit concerned and wanted to see if she was all right, but he remained silent. Paige watched JJ walk in the house with the dog by the collar. JJ let the dog go once he was inside the house. He commanded him to go lay in his bed before walking to his bedroom. JJ let out a long drawn-out yawn as he shuffled to his dresser drawer. JJ was just thankful that the chaos was due to the gator and not some cartel or Russian or even government agent after them. JJ exited the house again, this time in clothes. He was sporting a gray shirt with red letters saying Cajun along with tattered jeans, complete with combat boots. I'll be back, try not to kill each other. He yelled back at them. The constant bickering between them was getting to JJ a bit. He was used to doing things alone, now he had them two to deal with. He hopped into his truck and peeled out, wiping the sleep from his eyes still. Paige was still trying to get a signal on her phone. She finally found a good spot and opened her email. It was a video from an unknown email address. She opened it anyway and braced for the worst. Nate walked up behind her, peeking over her shoulder. Paige paid no attention to Nate as she waited for the video to buffer and play. To her shock, it was her father on the screen. If you are seeing this, then I am gone and you have control of the company. I made this email to automatically be sent to your email in the event of my death, and or if someone tried to hack or break into the company's system. As you know, there is a software that has everyone in a craze. The real disk is hidden. Hidden where only you and another person knows of it, and in the event that you don't, contact him within 24 hours after this email. He will destroy it for me. The reason I never destroyed it myself was, well, I didn't know my people were creating it to begin with, until it was too late. The program could wireless access any nuclear device on Earth, including reactor cores, without having to bypass security software. It also allows access into any secure system. Anyone can break into or go through any security system in the world, even our weapons facilities. I finally got a hold of the real disk and all its material and hid it. I was afraid to destroy it, for that meant I didn't have leverage to keep us safe, so I hid it and trusted a man who saved my life. The other reason I didn't have him destroy it was, I was afraid that you would end up in the same situation and need the disk. Her father paused a moment and then continued. Paige could feel a lump in her throat, and she fought to hold back the tears. She didn't want to show any emotion, especially not in front of Nate. She cleared her throat and listened to her father. The man's name is Frederick Harrison. He will explain more on the matter when and if you meet him. Paige, you do not have to go down this road, but you chose to or have to. I pray you make the right decision and do what I could not do. John Welsh's message continued and gave her Fred's number as well as a choice. To go after the disk and destroy it herself or allow Fred to destroy it. She was going to do just that, let this Fred do her work for her and be done with it. Everything was going a lot better until she received a call. Hello. she asked, looking up at Nate. Well, I'm sure you probably received some sort of information by now. It was Agent Kevin O'Neill. She knew nothing was ever that easy. Before you hang up or get all huffy, let me inform you of the certain situation. Are you still there? He spoke in a sort of cocky tone. Yes. She gritted her teeth. Now, I suggest you find that disc or your pal Mitch. Well, he won't be around to help you and your company if you don't. I just want the disc. Give it to me and you can go back to the normal everyday life. Paige laughed sarcastically at the last part. Her life would never be normal again. Not after her father was taken from her, and then it was never normal to begin with. You have a week, Ms. Welsh. I will call you back in due time. The agent said, hanging up. Paige almost threw her phone but refrained from it. Who was that? Nate asked, finally buttoning his shirt. Agent O'Neill. He says he wants the disc or he will kill Mitch. She cursed to herself as she walked back into JJ's house. JJ drove down the small back road until he figured he was far enough from the house. He went off the road and then backed up to the waterfront. The Cajun slid out of his driver's seat and walked around to the back of his truck. All right, buddy, let's go. He let his tailgate down and reached in to grab the gator. He caught his tail and dragged him out of the back of the truck and walked a few feet to the bank of the bayou. Remember, we used to come out here? Sean asked as he appeared beside JJ. Not physically appearing, but the warped mind of the Cajun, to him it was real. Yeah, Mama would fuss at us for being out here too late. He chuckled a bit as he sat the gator down. He slowly took the pocket knife from his pocket and began to carefully cut the tape. Johnny, do you think you will ever succeed in this so-called mission of yours? I mean, why not just go to the CIA and be done with it? Sean asked as he looked over at JJ's demon side. I won't quit until they are all dead. I have come too far to turn back now. Plus, they are all involved. JJ ripped the tape from the gator's mouth and stood up. He watched it run into the water as his two voices in his head fought. JJ was used to the voices and often just let them fight. They both had a good point, but he sided with his demon, like always. Sean, I have to finish what I started. No turning back now. He stuffed his knife back in his pocket and walked back to his truck. Paige walked in and plopped on the sofa. She laid her head back and tried to grasp everything that was happening to her, the dog, and Nate soon followed her inside. Nate sat down beside her, and the dog went lay in his bed. So we call this Harrison guy and get the disc and then give it to O'Neill? Paige asked, looking at Nate. That sounds simple, but it won't be. Nate shook his head. You know, as soon as they get the disc, everyone in that room or connected to it will be eliminated. Simino was in deep and was helping Kevin. Kevin tried to kill him and myself, so you know this is just a death trap, no matter what. The cartel nor the government mess around. When they want you dead, you are dead. No loose ends, no others involved to rat them out. Nate took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Well, I can't let Mitch die, Nate. What if we call Agent Jefferson with the FBI? He helped before with putting away William. Paige spoke a little aggravated. How do we know he isn't working with them? What do you expect, Paige? This to be all rainbows and butterflies. We are talking about the cartel and the government but Paige cut him off. I know that Nathaniel, I have to at least try and help Mitch. He is all I have left. The words kinda hurt Nate. He had been there for her this whole time and she didn't seem to notice. Nate didn't respond. Instead, he got up from the couch and went into his room. Paige just noticed what she had said. They might have been at each other's throats these past couple of days, but Nate was there for her. Paige merely meant family-wise, Mitch being the only one left, but it came out different. Nathaniel did help her in her past troubles, and even now, but he wasn't family. She felt very different about him. A part of her cared deeply for Nate, but another part wanted to smack him at times. The door swung open and JJ walked back in. JJ walked straight to the fridge and grabbed a bottle of water. He then poked his head into the living room, seeing Paige sitting in the dark. You alright? He asked as he opened his water and walked in. I received an email on the location on a disk or software, and also phone call from that agent," she said, looking straight ahead. JJ took a long gulp and then sat in his camouflage recliner. He turned on the light beside it, so he could see her better. Paige's eyes slowly wandered over to him. "I have to get that disc. Mitch, a family friend, is in danger." JJ nodded as he rocked up and down, understanding her completely. He didn't know the young woman that well, but he could relate to her on wanting to help family. Yet another sidetrack to an already derailing plan. JJ was quickly reminded of something he had read out of the small Bible he was given. He still had the book that the preacher had given him in the cafe. Every now and then he would pick it up and thumb through it, as if it was calling out to him to read. Part of him wanted to dig deep into it and change his ways, but he was so deep into this trouble, he was afraid there was no way out for him. The parable of the lost coin. Later, suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Doesn't she light a lamp, sweep the house and search carefully until she finds it? 9. And when she finds it, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, "Rejoice with me, I have found my lost coin." 10. In the same way, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Sinner was exactly what JJ was. All the horrible acts he committed in the name of revenge. Paige was that poor woman, looking to find that disc and help reclaim her life, and JJ was a sinner in need of repentance. "Where is Nate?" JJ asked, looking for him, trying to take his mind off his thoughts. "What did he say about it?" Before she could answer, Nate came out the room with his shirt fixed and pants proper. "We have a 4 o'clock flight," he said, standing in front of the both of them. "What are you talking about?" Paige was so confused. JJ looked just as confused but waited for him to explain it. "A flight where? What are you talking about?" Paige asked, looking up at him. "Frederick gave me directions to meet him in a cafe pub in London." Nate looked up and in the distance. He had been on the phone with the man this whole time. It was a bad idea, but they at least needed the disc for leverage. Either way, the CIA and other hitmen would not stop hunting them. At least this way they could have the upper hand and possibly another soldier in the fight. "Frederick lives in London. He used to work for the United Kingdom Special Forces, the Royal Mariners and such." Nate paused and looked over to JJ. "Frederick explained how him and your father were close, and he would tell you everything in person. Now we have at least a couple hours to get to the airport." "JJ, you in or what?" Nate looked over at him. "Macy," he said, hopping up from his chair. "Let me go pack." He smiled and went to walk out but came back. "You two might want to go and pick your own clothes, huh? They have a small town a little ways down the road," he said to Nate and Paige. "Yeah, I need to pick up some things." Nate nodded. Paige was still in shock that Nate actually went and called this Fred guy. Now she really felt crappy for once, she said. Paige nodded her head and rose from the couch. "Y'all can take my truck." JJ pointed to the keys hanging in the kitchen. Nate gave him a look. "That huge, horrible, redneck truck?" he asked, trying to hide the smirk. "Hey, don't talk about I ride like that, man." JJ eyed Nathaniel before walking back into his room. JJ was glad to have them two helping him. He knew this so-said disc was the trick to finding Kevin. One more person he needed to take out before he could get to Marina. It was a speed bump, a really huge one, but he was inching closer to his justice. Chapter 20. Jefferson sat behind his desk drumming his pen against the computer mouse pad. The tapping nose, along with his legs shaking under him, made a sort of rhythm. He huffed and looked at the stack of files on his desk, and then around at everyone else. The Welsh case was sort of closed, but something in his gut made him feel otherwise. Another agent walked around the corner and tossed an evidence bag on his desk. Jefferson watched the bag slide in front of him. He looked up at the other agent, and then back to the bag. "What's this?" he asked, raising a brow. "The security disc from Mr. Welsh's building." The other agent spoke and put his hands on his hips. "And why am I just now getting this?" He looked at the other agent sideways. Hey, don't fuss at me. Be lucky the captain let me give it to you. He said the case was closed, but I knew if you would have found out about this and never at least watched it, you would blow up on everyone, so you're welcome. The other again gave a sarcastic smile before turning to walk off. Jefferson didn't argue back. He took the CD out of the plastic bag and shoved it into his computer. The agent then waited for the screen to pop up, then pressed play. The date at the bottom of the screen was the date of the murder. Jefferson scanned the screen and watched the people come in and out the building. The other floors on the screen were not as important. He just focused on the front lobby for some reason. Jefferson noticed a dark-haired man walk in and walk over to the secretary. The two exchanged words and the man walked past her. She followed him, arguing, and looked as if she was trying to stop him. This piqued the agent's interest. He watched it a bit longer as the man entered Welsh's office, which was not under surveillance. He needed to call the secretary and find out who this guy was. Jefferson reached over and removed his phone from his pocket, and then an old file to find out the woman's name and number. He dialed it and waited for her to pick up. "Hello," she said in a chipper voice. "Hello, Ms. Lizzie. This is Agent Charles Jefferson from the FBI. Remember, I was working on Mr. Welsh's case." He paused and waited for her to answer. He could tell that her tone had shifted when she answered back. "Yes, sir, I remember." Her tone now gloomy, as if the voice of the agent brought back the horrible sight she encountered. "I'm sorry to have to call you up again, but I have a few questions. I know you probably do not want to go over everything again, but I have just recently found the security disc, and I have a question about the man that looked, well, as if he just barged into the office." "The tall, dark-haired one?" he asked. "Yes, Mr. Jefferson, that was Agent O'Neill with the CIA. I never really mentioned him because, well, I thought you guys all worked together, you know." She trailed off. Jefferson sat up in his chair that he was reclining in when she said this. "A CIA agent?" Jefferson asked, making sure he heard correctly. "Yes, sir." He was very pushy and demanded to see Mr. Welsh. He would often call into the office to speak, well, more like argue with Mr. Welsh. She added in, "Thank you, Ms. Lizzie. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me," he said, ending the call with her. He had the disc paused on the agent with his hands on Mr. Welsh's door. He needed to find out who and what a CIA agent was doing, bothering Mr. Welsh hours before his death. Europe. Agent Kevin O'Neill was already in Germany meeting up with his partner Laura Taylor. She was to track down and find Nikolai, or Nick for short, Mikhailov, Mick's brother, and Vito, the hangman, his second in command. Laura tracked them down in the middle of Germany and had a meeting with them. Kevin knew that Nikolai would not help without his brother, Mikhailov, unless his brother was released. The CIA was the reason why he was in jail to begin with. So, Kevin pulled some strings to get him released from the prison. He convinced the CIA that they were part of his plans with the cartel. The shifty agent played both sides, never really joining to either. Everything he did was to his own benefit. As Kevin unboarded the plane, he called Laura, the other agent that shared his views. "Yes, sir," she said, speaking into the phone, her long blonde hair pulled into a ponytail up and out of her face. She crossed one arm under her short brown trench coat and walked away from the others. "Taylor, how are my boys?" he asked, walking out of the airport and waving down a taxi. "Mikhailov just arrived, sir, and they are well." She paused and turned around to look at the small group of criminals. The tall, 6'5" Vito, also known as the hangman, had a guy wrapped in a noose, his feet tiptoeing, and was barely touching the floor. The brothers, Nikolai and Mikhailov, stood a couple of feet in front of the man, watching. "There, well, boys will be boys, sir," she said, turning back around. She could hear the laughing coming from them as the rope pulled up. "Good, I'll be there in 20 minutes. Did you hear anything from Marina?" Kevin asked. "No, sir, she has yet to contact me," Laura answered. "Very well, I will try her a little later." Kevin hung up the phone and tossed his bag into the cab. Mick, glad to have you back, my brother. Here's your release present. The man who was your third in command whom testified at your trial. Vito, let's see if he has anything to say. Nick waved his hand at the taller blonde. The hangman let the rope go a bit and let the man fall to the ground. Vito still gripped the rope and leaned on it a bit. The man stood up and Vito towered behind him. Mick smiled at his younger brother and walked up to the tied man. Suo, he said, looking over the man with his blue eyes. The man tried to speak, but the rope was so tight, and he couldn't catch his breath from being hung. The man coughed as Mick watched him. Mick turned and looked at his brother, then back to the man. You traitor, he said, spitting on the ground in front of the man. Mick, I had no choice. They threatened my family. Mick got in the man's face, pulling his hair back. We were your family, you idiot. I trusted you to help get me out, not keep me in. He smacked him in the face. The man started to whimper. The family's group of criminals was fewer than the original large numbers from when the brother's father was in charge. The CIA and Russian government had a lot to do with that issue. Nick noticed the blonde agent in the corner with her arms crossed. He slowly walked over towards her. Enjoying the show? He asked, in a thick accent. Nick stood in front of her, looking deep into her hazel eyes. She stood quiet for a moment, watching the other two torture the other man. Then she glanced back at Nick. I do not enjoy waiting. She spoke with a low tone as if she was bored. Come now, Ms. Taylor, is it? You cannot tell me this isn't entertaining. He smirked an evil grin. She shook her head. Pulling wings off a helpless fly is far from entertaining. She shook her head slowly in disappointment. Nick laughed a bit. Oh, he is more than a fly. Do you even know who he is? Do you know who we are? He placed his hand on his chest, having the same twisted smile painted on. Yes, I do. Brothers Nikolai and Mikhailov. Your father, Vladimir, whom handed the rebel group over to you when he passed away. Mother died during childbirth of your younger sister, who also perished. Nick's smile dropped a bit as she began to explain. You and your brother gained quite the nasty following with your brutal ways and extreme ideas. Your father ruled with an iron fist and a cold heart, and by the looks of it so do you too. Bezumi is the name of this large rebel group. In the 90s, your father allied himself with the Mexican cartel, who also had an agreement with the CIA, in order to control not only American, but world criminal organizations. Laura paused and waited for Nick's response. Well, looky here, did you read all that out of a little vanilla file? He asked as his face went stone cold. Most of it, the rest I have learned over watching the lot of you. Mick is the leader, but you seem to have pull over him. He would do anything for his younger brother. Also, he grew up and had more of his mother's touch, something you lacked given the more cruel ways. Vito, he seems to be well under your thumb. She watched as Vito held on to the rope. Nick let out an amused laugh. Well, I do have that effect on people. They can't help but follow me. Plus, when I was a boy, I saved his life. Vito and his sister were kicked out of their country, Italy. They came to Russia when they were children, and their ex-mafia father joined our father's group. I guess once it's in your blood, he trailed off a bit. Anyways, Vito showed great potential for being a killer at a young age. Nick turned and stood beside her, watching Vito lift the man up with the rope. He was obsessed with those old westerns. Even the baddest outlaw came to the hangman. That's why he took the name. A little off subject, but anyways, Vito and I were around, I say 13 at the time. A Russian soldier came poking around my father's warehouse. Vito jumped him before he could discover any of the weapons that my father had stored there. Now Vito was a big boy even back then, but still no match alone for the soldier. The man was about to shoot him before I snuck up behind him and slit his throat. Ever since then he pledged himself to me. Nick finished his little story and watched Laura watch the other three men. Ruthless, I can see why Marina would want you in her group. Laura continued to watch the others. Yes, indeed. I will be replacing Vespa as liaison for our group into her little organization. Our fathers had an alliance and I intend on keeping it. Nick smiled and watched the agent a bit more. Laura could feel his eyes on her, but she did not care. She could care less what they did, just as long as they agreed to keep this little thing going. Kevin would arrive soon and take over command to represent the cartel's interests. Laura worked for both, as did Kevin. She didn't even know which side he was on, but she would follow her superior either way. Laura was that loyal to Kevin, and Nikolai picked up on that quick. It could be used as a weakness for her if he needed to press her in the future. He didn't trust the fact that Kevin was also CIA, and would speak to Marina more on the matter in person, given the chance. In the meantime, he would help his brother resemble their father's business and group. Chapter 21. "'Cause I'm back in black, I'm back in black." JJ hit the high notes and sang along to the radio. Nate shook his leg out of aggravation. Looking out of the window, he tried to remain sane from Johnny's singing. Paige, she was stuck right beside him. Each note her teeth grinded into each other. Finally, she had enough and changed the station to pop radio. JJ stopped singing for a moment. He listened to it as he watched the road, and then started to sing with it. My poker face, oh." Paige quickly changed the station again. She didn't enjoy the horrible singing, but the silence would be worse. Hopefully she could find a radio station or music he didn't know. She landed on country and looked at JJ, who instantly started singing. "Might be a little dust on the bottle, but don't let it fool you." He drummed the steering wheel, and Paige turned the station again. She heard Nate mumble something, but couldn't hear him over the Cajun singing. Paige finally just turned the radio off. "Do you know every song on the radio?" she asked in an aggravated tone, glancing over at JJ. JJ smiled, tilted his head down, peering over his dark aviator glasses to look at her. "My head is filled with song lyrics and movie quotes." JJ was telling half the truth. The other half was that the music and singing kept the voices in his head quiet. JJ turned his head back to watch the road. "Plus, I do a lot of driving, Shaw. I can't just sit and brood like Mr. Serious over there." He pointed with his thumb at Nate. "Silence is better than your singing, that's for darn sure." Nate sat up and glared at JJ. Paige sat back on the seat and just shook her head. "Well, I'd rather be tone deaf than a butthole." JJ laughed a bit. "A butthole? What are we, 5?" Nate sat up and turned completely around to face JJ. Paige could tell he was about to explode. His bronze skin flushed with a slight red color. "You have some nerve. You blew up a whole nightclub just to get to me." Nate spoke up louder. Paige just stared at the green, gold, and purple Mardi Gras bead hanging from the rearview mirror. She tried to take her mind off of the two idiots arguing. "That's because you're not the easiest person to catch alive, and you were worth more alive to me," JJ yelled back. "But hurting innocent people in the process." Nate yelled back. "Innocent? Innocent? Those people in there were drunks, druggies, and whatever else. They would down a keg and get in their cars and drive and kill innocent people. I know. I was a cop for almost 10 years. I held a little kid's brain in my hands as he lay dying in the back seat because of a drunk driver. You have the nerve. You belong to the same organization I did, Mr. Rafflebull. As I remember, your hands are just as stained as mine, so stop calling me a black pot." "Pot," was all Nate could say. "Yeah, you're the pot, calling the kettle black, you know the saying." "Don't act stupid," JJ hissed. "Oh, I'm stupid now," Nate growled. "Compared to you, Cajun, I'm a rocket scientist." Nate went to continue fussing, but Paige finally intervened. "Okay. Enough," she yelled over Nate. JJ watched the road fuming. JJ was highly pissed off at Nate's hypocrisy. Paige was glad because the constant yelling in her ears was giving her a headache. "Whatever," Nate said, turning to sit forward. "You should know, you were in the military. Is it not what made you crack and say screw it all? We all have our demons, Nate." "Stop pointing fingers." Johnny shook his head and wiped his mouth. Nate didn't respond other than the usual aha. Paige looked over at Nate, then to JJ. "This is going to be so much fun," she thought to herself, sarcastically. The hum of the road overpowered the noise, and JJ started humming. JJ was about to start singing again, due to the voices screaming in his head to reach over and knock Nate one, but Paige raised a finger. JJ, she snapped him a look and tried not to smile. JJ was growing on her, so she treated him a bit kinder than she did Nate. JJ stopped and smiled over at her a bit. All right, I will stop. JJ continued to grin as he watched the road. Nate turned to look at the two of them. He was fuming, and that look JJ gave her made it even worse. Nate crossed his arms and began to shake his leg again. It jiggled the seat and Paige with it. She was already squashed between them, as well as annoyed, and couldn't take much more. Paige finally slammed her hand down on his knee to get him to stop. She didn't mean to do it so hard, but he was vibrating her. He stopped and looked down at her hand, and realizing what she did, Paige slowly removed her hand and placed it back into her lap. The trio finally arrived at the airport. Nate was the first one out. JJ had barely parked before he bolted out and walked to the back of the truck. He grabbed Paige's bag out of the back and handed it to her hard. Paige glared at Nate when she caught it and slung it over her shoulder. Nate then grabbed his own bag and walked ahead of them. JJ followed along with Paige behind Nate. JJ knew that heated conversation in the truck got to the soldier, but he didn't care. Mr. High and Mighty needed to be brought down to earth, and him taking it out on Paige wasn't right. If he kept that up, the Cajun would not hesitate to say something again. Don't let him get to you, Paige. He is a stubborn bull, and if he keeps up, I will go all no country for old men on him. He cracked a smile at his own joke, but Paige didn't understand. It was a movie where the guy used a cow punch to kill people, JJ explained, and Paige giggled a bit. Nate couldn't believe he was in this mess, and worst, with the idiot Cajun. JJ was known to be a loudmouth, hothead sometimes, one of the worst people to work with or come across, in Paige. She was like being all buddy-buddy with him. Nate turned to see them walking side by side. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see her smiling. She never smiled like that with him. Nate turned back around and huffed as he went towards the ticket counter. The three boarded the plane, and Nate took the seat in front of them. He stuffed his bag in the overhead compartment and then sat down, silent. JJ started humming as he sat close to the window. JJ looked out the window and then up at Paige as she sat down beside him. You look nervous, JJ. She sat beside him and crossed her legs. Not much of a flyer. I rather drive to where I have to get to. He shifted in his seat. At least there's no music and hey look, noise-canceling headphones. Nate put in as he reached for them. JJ shot him a look at the back of his head. Nate turned around to face them. Don't be all kissy face on the plane now, Nate said before turning back around in his seat, putting the headphones on his head. Paige used her hands as if to choke Nate's neck as she glared. Shame on you, Ms. Welsh, you are supposed to be a lady. JJ joked and scooted back in the seat. He put his foot on his knee and shook his foot. His boot strings were slightly untied, and they clinked on the rubber sole, making a tapping noise. JJ knew Nate must have been jealous of him. He didn't know why. It wasn't like he was trying to get with Paige, and the looks of it, Paige and Nate hated each other. It was like they were just stuck together. So how did you and Super Serious meet? He interlaced his fingers and sat them on his belly. Paige sat back and got comfortable before she spoke. Well, after my father died, I wanted to catch the man who had killed William Green. I hired Nate to help me. She looked over at the back of Nate's head. And did you kill him? JJ asked her, watching her expression, how it went from slightly happy to saddened and hard. She turned to look JJ. No, I turned him into the FBI. Agent Jefferson. She nodded and uncrossed her leg, getting comfortable as the flight attendant passed by, passing out drinks. She took a water and JJ took the same and some peanuts. He sat up and opened the bag. Paige opened her water and took a sip and placed it in between her thighs. What about you, JJ? You were cop for so long, why change sides? She asked. Well, I guess a lot of it had to do with my brother. My brother was a speed junkie and I liked doing stupid stuff, and I was always there to get him out of trouble. I also like to help people, you know. He cracked open a peanut and popped it in his mouth. So we decided to join the local police department. At that time we lived in Lafayette. I moved out to New Iberia. Mama wanted to be by her sister. He laughed as he tossed a peanut shell at Nate. Paige watched it fly over Nate's head. She shook her head and turned to listen to JJ tell what seemed to be his life story. It would be a long flight, so she didn't mind. At least someone talked to her. Anyway, things were fine until a drug bust went wrong. My brother took 2 to the chest, and the politician got off with a slap on the hand. No jury, no conviction, not even a trial. I lost it and blew him up along with his $100,000 car and house. JJ tossed another peanut at Nate. This time Nate jumped a bit. They could hear Nate mumble something but couldn't make it out. Why blow him up? She asked. I know he deserved it and all, but what made you want to take him out like that? She asked, clarifying the question. Well, JJ ate another peanut. Me and my brother used to make sparkler bombs when we were kids, always had firecrackers. Hell, our cats hated us. He laughed, but I think I really got into it when my mom wanted me to help her blow up my uncle's truck. He was cheating on my aunt, her sister, with some raunchy lot lizard, and I helped her. Paige shook her head, trying to figure out what he said. A lot lizard? She asked, trying not to laugh. Yeah, he tossed another peanut. A hooker that stays around truck drivers, you know, gas stations and rest stops. Nate growled and tossed the shell back at JJ without even turning around. Paige knew he was fuming, and JJ just laughed at him. She never met anyone as crazy and carefree as Johnny. He was not afraid of Nate at all. JJ laughed his crazy laugh and dug into his bag to get another peanut. He loved pushing Nate's buttons. He was always so serious, and JJ just wanted Nate to lighten up. Paige was a sweet girl, JJ could tell. She had just gotten mixed up with the wrong people. He also knew if the cartel had her on target, then she would never have peace, just like him. The rest of the flight, JJ told his story to Paige, and she told her story to him. The flight landed and the trio unboarded. Nate still brushing peanut shells off his bald head and shoulders, mumbling under his breath. Paige was behind him with JJ trying not to laugh. After going through customs and all that jazz, the 3 found a cab and tossed their stuff into the trunk, then they squeezed inside. Nate told the driver where to go and then sat back, glaring out of the window. JJ had a smile of wonderment on his face as he watched the building pass. I always wanted to come here, he said, smiling over at Paige. Paige kept a warm smile on her face as she watched the 2 men, each with completely opposite personalities. The trio made it to the restaurant around noon. Nate picked an outside table so he could oversee everything. Paige sat beside Nate and JJ sat directly across from Paige. Nate rolled his eyes and kept watch. Do you even know what this guy looks like? Paige asked, looking at Nate. No, but I'm sure I can spot him out. Nate watched the people pass on foot and in the cars that drove by. I want to go see the big clock, JJ blurted out of nowhere. This isn't a vacation, we are not here for a tour. Nate shook his head, not even looking at them. Well, aren't you a buzzkill? JJ said, opening a menu. The waiter came by the table and poured them some water. Fish and chips. Hey, why do y'all say chips and not fries? JJ asked the waiter, who looked at the Cajun a little funny. Just ignore him, he's an idiot, Nate told the waiter. JJ snapped him a look. Paige placed her head in her hands and sighed loudly. Nate's attention quickly went to the motorcycle that pulled up and parked by a meter. He watched as the man turned the bike off and took his helmet off. Nate sat up in his chair a bit and observed him more. The man stood up and stuffed the keys in his jacket. He slowly removed his gloves and stuck them inside his jacket as well. The man was around JJ and Nate's height and build. He had short reddish blonde hair and a clean-shaven face. The man looked around before walking towards the tables. The way he walked and held himself, Nate knew right away that this was Frederick. The hostess greeted him and Frederick smiled. He had a huge smile and large teeth, almost looking like a handsome shark. He turned and noticed the three watching him. Frederick noticed Nate and knew they were there for him. He walked over towards them and stood at the table. "Mr. Steele and Miss Welsh, I presume?" he asked in his British accent as he looked at Nate and Paige. He then looked over at JJ. His face was straight and professional, his eyes were blue, and they held a certain look. Compassion, yet strength. Paige looked him over a bit longer than she should. He was quite different than Nate. Nate was more dark and blunt, while Frederick was a gentleman. "I'm Johnny Simoneau. You can call me JJ." JJ broke the awkward silence and offered Fred his hand. "Frederick Harrison." Fred took JJ's hand and shook it. Paige then stuck out her hand. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Harrison." Fred shook her hand and let it go. He then looked at Nate, who eyed him. Fred took a seat in front of Nate and gave a quick smile. Paige watched him the whole time, as did JJ. The four sat in silence for a moment. "So, Ms. Welsh, it is nice to meet you. I had the pleasure of working for your father a while back. I'm sorry to hear of his passing," he said, looking over at her. Paige sat up straight in her seat and gave a faint smile. JJ was really curious about this new player to the game. He was a soldier, just like Nate, but he seemed a bit more friendlier. Fred was sitting up straight with his hands under the table. Nate leaned back and had his arms crossed, studying Frederick. Frederick noticed it out the corner of his eye but didn't pay any mind. JJ had his arm and elbow on the table with his fingers drumming a silent beat. His head in his other hand turned to listen to Fred and Paige talk. "If you don't mind me asking, what did you do for my father?" she asked. "The British government had a couple contracts with Mr. Welsh. Me being in the UKSF at the time, I was assigned to look after and assist your father. A glorified bodyguard, if you will." He paused to look at JJ, who was checking out the waitresses behind. He smirked a bit and turned back to face Paige. Nate rolled his eyes at JJ and shook his head. JJ noticed Nate making a face at him, and he just smiled back at the bull. JJ knew how to push Nate's buttons. His silliness was way more effective at pissing him off than anything else. "What I want to know is, why do you have this disc?" Nate blurted out. He wanted answers, and he didn't care if he was rude or not. Paige shot Nate a look. "Nathaniel." She spoke in almost a motherly tone, as if she was ashamed. "What?" He looked at her. "I want to know why I had to come across an ocean, and of all places and people, why him. No offense." He had a mutual respect for Fred, him being in armed forces such as himself, but Nate did not feel like waiting around and getting cozy. He wanted this to be all done with. JJ felt the same way, but the Cajun was brought up with better manners. No, it is quite all right." Fred raised a hand and smiled at Paige, to reassure her it was all right. JJ was starving and really didn't care about the beef that would happen between the two. He finally got a hold of the waitress's attention. JJ kept a sweet smile on his face as he asked the waitress to get him the chef's special. "Thanks, Shaw." He gave her a wink and turned back around again to face the others. To his surprise, they paid him no mind as they were in their own deep conversation. "I was in charge of making sure Mr. and Mrs. Welsh got around the city safe and unharmed. I did fail at my mission." His mood shifted. A long-time pain that haunted him, it was written on his face. He placed his hands on the table. Paige leaned in more to listen. I should have been the one driving." He paused and looked away for a moment, and then his eyes fell back on Paige. It was dark, pitch black, and the rain came down ever so hard. "Your parents were in the back and I was in the passenger seat. The driver was a rookie, Colin. He begged me to give him more responsibilities. So I thought, just driving us back from dinner was enough." He adjusted himself in the seat. Fred's eyes then focused on the white tablecloth. He lost control of the car and it spun and slammed into a tree. "I was only to retrieve your father. I went back for your mother, but the car." He stopped again. Paige could tell he was sincere and hurt. She placed her hand on his. The waitress sat down JJ's food and walked away to wait on others. JJ rubbed his hands together and picked up a piece of fish. He bit into it and frowned. Where is the seasoning? He dropped it back into the plate. Nate took a long deep breath, trying not to blow up. Fred looked over at him, as did Paige. What is wrong? Fred asked. He's Cajun, that's what's wrong. They practically drink hot sauce. Surprised he doesn't have some in his pocket, Nate crossed his arms and scoffed. JJ put up a finger and with his other hand dug in his pockets. He whipped out and sat a small bottle of Tabasco sauce down. Oh my God. Nate turned his whole body away from him and the table. He couldn't bear to put up with JJ at the moment. JJ chuckled a bit at Nate's reaction. What's the matter, Shaw? He asked Nate, who kept facing the other direction. Paige covered her smile and Fred lifted a brow. What is that? The Brit asked. Tabasco sauce. I put it on everything. JJ unscrewed it and put it close to Fred's nose. Oh heavens. Fred jerked away and covered his nose. What is that awful smell? He scooted away from JJ a bit. It's called a crazy Cajun. Nate finally turned back around. You put that on everything? Fred asked. That and Creole seasoning probably would put it on your biscuits, JJ joked, pouring it on the fries. I would certainly not put it on my biscuit, Fred joked along with Johnny and smiled a bit. At least you have a sense of humor. JJ bit into his fry and then another. He was starving and didn't care if the others were upset. Well, we should head to my apartment for further business, after Mr. Simoneau eats, that is. Fred added. Anything you say, biscuit. JJ was deep into his food. Well then it is settled, hot sauce. Fred joked back, giving JJ his own pet name. Paige swiped a fry from his plate and slowly bit into it. Not that bad. She shrugged and glanced off at Nate. Nate just gave her a straight and annoyed face. Chapter 22. Paige shoved Johnny as they rode in the back of a taxi. They were headed to Fred's place, and JJ had dozed off for a bit. JJ snorted and sat up. His face had been stuck against the glass, leaving a print against it. Sorry, not used to the time change, bad dreams. He wiped a little bit of drool from the side of his face. Nate just stared at him and shook his head. Nightmare? He asked, lifting a brow as he noticed the drool. JJ laughed a little and sat up more. More like daymare. How much farther to his place anyways? He asked and looked out of the window at the passing buildings and cars. Of all memories, of all dreams, why did it have to be that one? He was already under enough stress, and for his brain to bring up Becky, his ex-girlfriend, an already touchy subject, was not helping. Paige shrugged a bit. I have no clue, she said as she too looked out the window. Nate kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, always on the watch, always cautious. After another 10 minutes of silence, the car finally parallel parked in front of a building. Fred's bike parked in front of it. Nate hopped out first and looked both ways as he stood waiting for Paige. Paige stepped out and looked up at the building, then over to Fred, who was waiting on them with his helmet in hand. The driver got out, and Nate followed him to the trunk to get the bags. JJ stepped out and almost tripped. His foot had gotten stuck, and he waddled a bit to catch his balance. You all right there, mate? Fred asked, lighting up a cigarette as he waited. Yeah, I'm good. He adjusted his purple LSU t-shirt and went to help Nate with the bags. Fred took a long puff and let the smoke out. Paige took out her phone and glanced down to see if she had any missed calls or messages, but there was nothing. So you have the disc here? She asked, shoving her phone back into her pocket and looking over at Frederick. Yes. Also, I'm sure you will need somewhere to stay. I have plenty of room. He smiled and put his cigarette out and saved the rest behind his ear. Nate and JJ came around the side of the car, carrying the bags. Paige paid the driver and then the four entered the building. Nate walked ahead with Fred, while JJ walked alongside Paige. So, what were you dreaming about? Paige asked JJ, a bit concerned. JJ lifted his head a bit and glanced over at her. Oh, It was nothing, just a bad memory. He gave her a warm smile to let her know he was okay. Paige smiled back at him. She wasn't going to pry into his personal life. JJ was glad that Paige cared enough to ask him if he was alright. He wasn't used to that, someone caring about him. Paige knew it was none of her business really. She had just met the man, but he was rather sweet and was helping her. Well, if you want to talk about it, I'm here, she said, turning her head to watch Fred enter the elevator. Nate stopped a couple feet from it and watched him. JJ and Paige entered the elevator and looked at Nate. My apartment is on the top floor, Fred said, stopping the doors from closing as he waited for Nathaniel. Nate hated elevators and huffed a bit before using all his will to slowly walk in. JJ looked at Nate funny. You okay, Shaw? Why you bouding? He asked. Bouding? Fred asked JJ, looking over at him as he pressed the top floor button. It's a Cajun word for sulking, JJ informed the Brit. Oh yes, I forgot. Nate, you don't like elevators, Paige explained, but Nate shot her a look. She stopped talking and looked at him funny. Don't like elevators. JJ smiled a bit, plotting in his head. Sorry, we have to take it. They are currently working on the stairs on the first floor, Fred explained, leaning back and watching the numbers go up. Paige stuffed her hands in her dress pockets and looked at the floor. Her eyes slowly went to Nate's legs. He was jiggling them nervously. JJ started to hum and then sing. Love in an elevator, living it up when I'm going down. He sang, jumping a bit, making it bounce a bit. Nate dropped the bag he was holding and gripped the railing. He then growled and shot JJ an evil look. Love in an elevator, loving it up till I hit the ground. Each word, he jumped. Fred tried hard not to laugh. He played it off by scratching his 5 o'clock shadow. Nate cursed under his breath and closed his eyes. Jonathan James Simino. I swear, he grunted behind his teeth. Paige bit on her lips, trying to hide her smile. It was payback for all the crappy things Nate had put JJ through. Oh, you sound like Mama, using my whole name. He shook the elevator a bit more. The elevator finally stopped and Nate was at the doors even before they opened. He stormed out and down the hall. JJ laughed and picked up his bag and slowly walked out whistling. Fred shook his head as he walked out, following the Cajun. Paige was last out the elevator and followed the boys down the hall. US FBI headquarters. Agent Jefferson barged into his captain's office and slammed the disc on his desk. Yes, Jefferson. Can I help you? His dark skin wrinkled along with his brow as he raised it. Sir, I have something on the Welsh case, he said, looking down at his captain. He pointed to the disc. A CIA agent, Kevin O'Neill, visited Mr. Welsh just before he was killed. I called the CIA headquarters, and they have no knowledge of what O'Neill was doing with Mr. Welsh. The captain reached over and slid the disc closer towards him, the CD reflecting on his dark brown hands. Okay, so you think this agent has something to do with Mr. Welsh's murder? The case is closed, so you better have more than just this, if we are going to reopen it, Jefferson. He took the disc out and popped it into his computer. Jefferson walked around and pointed out the agent on the disc. Oh, I will, sir. I need to get in touch with Ms. Welsh. But I have a feeling that O'Neill might have played a big part in this. The captain watched the footage and nodded. It's your case, Jefferson. Do what you have to. He took the disc out and handed back to him. Thank you, Captain. I won't let you down. He smiled and took the disc. You better not. I pluck you straight out the academy because you showed potential. He gave him a toothy smile, and Jefferson rushed out to try and reach Paige. London. Vito and Nick stood on the other side the street, where Frederick's apartment building was. Nick's eyes were focused on where the four entered, while Vito was busy eating. Agent O'Neill wanted the two to watch and intercept them if necessary. Marina was writing Kevin about the situation, and he was desperate to get a hold of the software. Nick's beady eyes never left the door where they entered, even while he listened to Vito smack on his fries. Must you eat so loudly? Nick asked Vito without looking up at him. Vito stopped chewing and looked down at him. It's how I eat. He made a whatever face and continued to munch on his fries. Nick took in a long hard breath and let it out slowly. How long do we have to watch them anyways? Vito asked, licking his fingers clean. As long as we must. You shouldn't complain so much, Vito. Isn't the bull the one who killed your sister? Nick said in a cocky way as his toothy grin spread across his face. Vito stopped eating and almost dropped his food. Is that who we are after? He almost screamed. A couple of people walking by looked at the two in a strange way. You never told me that it was Nathaniel that we were after. Vito glared up at the building. Yes, Violet's former group member. What was the name of it? Oh, yes, the Seven Devils, but we are not really after him. Our main goal is to get to the girl and get some kind of software. That is what my brother needs and the CIA agents want. Now that I have your full attention and cooperation, my lovely hangman, can we get something accomplished this day? Nick turned around and leaned against the building. Paige sat on Fred's couch a bit in a daze. Her eyes were focused on the wood floor, picking out certain patterns that made shapes. JJ had his head in the man's fridge. The Cajun had no shame. He just walked in and opened Fred's fridge. He needed to see what he had and what he could cook for them. JJ was not about to eat any more of the bland food from this country. Nate stood beside Paige. His arms were crossed and his eyes looked around the room. Fred took his riding jacket off and walked from the door towards the living room. He glanced and noticed the Cajun in the ice box, and all he could do was shake his head laughing. Make yourself at home. Fred let out a chuckle as his eyes fell on Paige and then Nate. A weird one that made, huh? Fred asked about JJ. You have no idea. Nate glared over at JJ, still mad about the elevator incident. Fred let out a faint chuckle before glancing down at Paige. Ms. Welsh, are you sure you want this? He asked in all seriousness. The girl looked like she had been through 3 levels of hell already. The stress shone on her face, and her once big eyes that were filled with laughter and happiness were now almost sunken in. As if she had been awake for 2 days, but Fred knew that look. On many missions, he had been in stressful situations. Fred looked over at Nate for a moment. Nathaniel was a fellow soldier like Frederick, always ready and willing to do anything possible to complete the mission. Paige was Nate's personal mission, and when a soldier made something personal, he was willing to do anything, even die. Paige looked up from the floor when he spoke. She was in far too deep to turn back now. She needed to end this and save Mitch's life. Yes, she had Nate, but Mitch was there for her since she could remember. He was like family to her, the only family she had left. Paige gave Fred a small nod and swallowed hard. All right. Fred nodded and made his way to his bedroom. Suddenly Nate's phone rang. He dug in his pocket, walking to the other side of the living room. JJ came out of the kitchen finally, finding a box of wheat thins to satisfy himself. Paige's eyes went from Nate up to JJ. She lifted a brow and looked at him a bit strange. Didn't you just eat? She asked him. JJ had stuffed about 4 of them into his mouth and was chewing away. Yeah, but I'm always hungry. He spoke with his mouth full and his hand already in the box digging for more. Hey Biscuit, do you have any beer? JJ called towards Fred's room. No, Fred raised his voice so JJ could hear. JJ shrugged it off and tilted the box towards Paige. Paige reached in and grabbed a handful of wheat thins, and began to munch on them. Nate answered the phone, not even looking at who was calling. He just thought it was Jamal with new information, but he was wrong. Hello, my little wrathful bull. The sweet Mexican voice spoke as Nate's eyes widened a bit. Marina. He covered his mouth to the phone so the others couldn't hear. How did you get this number? He blurted out. You act like you know nothing about me or my abilities. I have my ways, Nate. Nate turned back to see what the other two were doing. Paige was talking to JJ, while Fred was still in his bedroom. Nate then turned back around to face the wall. What in the hell do you want? He said harshly. Wow, still so demanding, aren't we? As I remember, you are the one who screwed me over. You got close to that little chica and killed not only Derek and Vespa, but helped her put my father in prison. Marina hissed but kept her calm. Nothing to say, Nate, she asked, breaking the short silence. I see the Cajun joined your cause. I haven't heard from him, and Kevin mentioned it. Nate was growing ever more furious. Yeah, you know why, Marina. For one, Kevin is playing you. He screwed JJ over and was going to bring us both in, not to you but to the CIA. All I did was save the girl. Kevin is the one who works for the CIA and got your father locked up, not me, and certainly not the idiot Cajun. So who are you going to be more upset with? Someone who just recently tried to leave the group and save an innocent girl, or someone who has been snitching on your whole family for over 6 years? Yeah, he may have told you he worked for the American government, but really gave you his allegiance. But Kevin is a snake in the grass. He will do and say anything to save himself and get ahead. Nate explained to Marina. The front door handle jiggled and opened slowly. JJ turned around, and both Paige and JJ's eyes fell on the female. She held a binder in her hands and a bag strapped over her shoulder. Her black shiny hair waved down and sat on her shoulder, and lightly brushed against her matcha-colored face. The way she was dressed and held herself, she looked like a businesswoman or a secretary. JJ waved a bit while Paige just sat there quietly. Hello, you must be Ms. Welsh. The young woman closed the door and sat the binder on the bar. She then made her way to the woman with a small smile and her hand outstretched. I'm Selena, Frederick's girlfriend and roommate. Paige slowly reached out and took the female's hand. A small forced smile formed on Paige's face as she shook her hand. Selena then turned to JJ. Oh. JJ wiped his hand on his shirt, and then took her hand with a cheerful and almost goofy smile. Johnny Simino, ma'am, but you can call me JJ. He sat the box of wheat thins on the small end table behind him without breaking away from shaking her hand. JJ looked over the attractive African-American woman. He noticed she didn't have a British accent, so she must have been an American like them. Fred came walking out the bedroom with a small jump drive in his hands. He smiled when he noticed Selena. JJ stopped shaking her hand and looked over at Nate fussing on the phone in the corner. Fred kissed Selena's cheek and wrapped his arm around her waist. What is he going on about over there? Fred asked, looking at JJ and down to Paige for an answer. Paige looked over to the corner where Nate was. She shrugged her shoulders and glanced down at the floor again. I have no idea. He's always like that. Paige spoke up as JJ walked over and plopped down beside Paige. You ain't never lied. JJ laughed and put his boot up on the coffee table. Fred removed his arm from Selena and held up the junk drive. This is what you are looking for, he smiled and sat the drive on the coffee table. Paige didn't take it, she just stared at the little black plastic thing. How could so much drama happen over this little thing? Nate's voice grew louder and everyone looked over at him. Paige had enough of it. She stood up and walked over to Nate to see what was going on. So Johnny, would you like to help me find something to cook? Since you have the Cajun flair and all. Fred asked with a smile. JJ practically flew off the couch. He walked to the kitchen rubbing his hands together. Selena and Fred chuckled a bit as they watched JJ for a moment. Fred then walked over to JJ and helped him pull out things to cook. Selena looked over at Nate and Paige in the corner, and then slowly over at Fred and JJ laughing in the corner. Her dark eyes then fell on the junk drive. She quickly scooped it up and stuffed it in her pocket. She then slowly but quickly grabbed her purse again and walked to the door. Fred noticed her by the door and perked his head up. Where you going? He asked as JJ rambled away about how he didn't have enough seasoning. Oh, to the store to pick up some things to cook. I will be back. She smiled and got halfway out the door. Let me come with you. Fred took a few steps towards her. No. She said harshly, then gave him a smile. I mean, you have guests, you should stay. I can handle it. Selena tried to clarify herself. Fine, Marina, fine. We can talk about all this later. I will let you know where Kevin is, and if you help me bring him down and leave us alone." Afterwards, Nate almost growled and then hung up the phone. Let's just say the devil wants to deal. He stuffed the phone forcefully into his pocket. "Marina. The Marina that recruited you and Johnny to that group?" Paige asked Nate. He nodded a bit to let her know she was correct. "Well, what does she want?" Paige almost huffed. "She wants O'Neill. She wouldn't tell me. She said that conversation was better left in person." He placed his hands on his hips and ground his teeth. "Well, at least we have one problem almost down. We have the software." Paige pointed to the table. She then took a double look and noticed it was not there. She then walked over to the table and looked underneath to see if it might have fallen. "Where is it?" She started to panic. Her eyes searched frantically around the room. "You didn't put it in your pocket?" Nate asked her, and Paige shook her head no. Her blonde ponytail shaking wildly. "No. No, I got up to see what was going on with you before I could." JJ looked over to them with a bowl and spatula in his hand. Fred overheard what she said and turned to face Paige. "Are you sure it isn't in your pocket?" Fred asked and then looked over at JJ. JJ shook the bowl and spatula and shrugged his shoulders. Paige turned her pockets inside out. "You saw me get up and walk over to Nate. I never touched it." Panic shone in her voice. Fred turned around to ask Selena, but she was gone. "Bloody hell." Fred cursed as he peeked out the door. Halfway down the hall he saw Selena running and rounding the corner. He took off running after her. Nate took off as well, without a word, and Paige followed. JJ blinked a couple times trying to process what was going on. He finally figured it out and tossed the bowl and spatula in the air. JJ ran out the apartment and took off after them as well. Selena ran down the hall gripping the drive in a death grip. She took a sharp turn, her heels screeching as she slid and reached out to press the elevator button. She frantically pressed it so hard the plastic sounded as if it would break. Fred heard the button mashing as he ran down the hall. He was in soldier mode and it shone on his face, the mode when nothing mattered but the mission, no matter the cost. No matter if they had dated, all this time it obviously was a lie. She played him for the fool. Nate and Paige were right behind Fred, and JJ was not far behind. "JJ, you go with Fred, I'll cut her off in the stairwell," Nate instructed, breaking away from Paige's side and headed to the stairwell door. The metal clanked when he pressed his body on it, forcing it open. The handle banged the concrete behind it, making a loud noise. "Nate and elevators, man." JJ shook his head as he replaced Nate running beside Paige. Paige just shook her head and turned to focus on Fred. Her legs started to burn, but she pushed herself forward. She was so close to having this whole fiasco done and over with. All they had to do was get the disc, turn it over to O'Neill and get Mitch back. Easier said than done. Selena saw Fred cut around the corner and almost panicked. You could see it in her eyes as they widened. She could no longer wait for the elevator, so she took off running down the rest of the hall towards the window. She broke it open and slithered through, avoiding the glass as she made her ascend to the roof. Fred was hot on her heels as he reached the window. He crawled up and out, only scraping his skin on the shards of glass. It wasn't deep enough to cause blood, just an irritating sting. Paige noticed them climbing out the window and stopped dead in her tracks. She cursed under her breath and turned back around to tell Nate what was going on, but he was in the stairs. Paige was always used to Nate being right beside her. JJ stopped to turn around and follow her, but the ding of the elevator caught his attention. A smirk spread across his face as he strolled inside whistling. JJ pressed the top floor button and watched the doors close slowly. The corny elevator music played as the elevator made its way upward. JJ, being JJ, started to make a beat to it. The beat then turned into a classic rock song, and the Cajun began to sing and jam, making the best of the slow ride. Paige rushed to the stairs, pushed open the door, and leaned over the railing. "Nate? Nate?" She heard his footsteps stop. "What?" He yelled angrily back up at her. "She is heading to the roof." She yelled down at him. He cursed, but she couldn't make out what he was saying. She then heard his loud footsteps again, but this time heading towards her. Paige turned and started to climb the stairs, not waiting for him. Selena climbed up the building with ease, hopping window ledge to window ledge and finally reaching the fire escape. Fred was not far behind her. He wasn't much for parkour, but his soldier training and his upper body strength helped him keep up. The two scrambled up the rickety fire escape, making a creak and squeak under their feet. Selena reached the top of the roof and took off running. The adjoining building was not too far away, and she had her sights set on it. At one point she almost fell when her heels hit the gravel, but she caught herself and pushed ahead. Fred finally hopped over the ledge and noticed her going for the other building. This was it, he had to catch her now and in the moment. He grunted and pushed himself hard as he ran after her. Paige slung open the roof door. Her eyes quickly squinted to the blinding sunlight. Her eyes needed to adjust from the dark hallway as she squinted, looking for the woman. Her chest rising and falling rapidly from the running. Her lungs were burning, but she ignored the pain. She could hear Nate's heavy stomps running up behind her, but Nate wasn't her problem, the woman who took the drive was. She lifted up a hand over her forehead so she could see better. That woman was not going to get away. They came all this way and spent all this time to find that drive, and Paige was not going to let it slip away that easy. JJ stepped out of the elevator and took off to the stairwell. As soon as he ran in, he met up with Nate, and the two ran up the last flight of stairs. The light from the outside in Paige's shadow let the guys know they had finally reached the top. Nate pushed past Paige, almost knocking her down as he did. Paige stumbled a bit, but JJ was behind her to help catch her balance. Selena went to jump to the other building, but as soon as her feet left the ground, Fred reached out and grabbed her ankle. She lost her balance and fell hard on the ledge. Her stomach slammed into the concrete, and she almost slid off the side, but Fred's strength held her. Half of her body hung over the edge. If he would let go, she would slam headfirst into the sidewalk 6 stories down. She let out a loud scream of frustration and growled. Fred laid on the ground trying to catch his breath before he would attempt to pull her up. "Let me go," she screamed, but dared not kick at him or squirm. Not the best request given the current situation. Fred grunted as he tried to stand up without letting her foot go. He wanted to drop her, but he knew they needed the drive. Plus he wasn't a stone-cold, heartless killer, unless ordered to be. Paige gasped when she saw the woman attempt to jump. She leaned against JJ, thank God. Nate stopped mid-run and panted as he watched the two in front of him. Fred helped her from over the edge and then forced her back on the ground. He then held out his hand and wiggled his fingers, silently demanding the drive. Selena looked up at him and then his hand. Nate went to walk over towards them, but JJ stopped him. He turned around and shot JJ a look. "No, they are having a moment." JJ gave Nate a toothy grin, but Nate gave him a glare. He raised his fist and shook it at him. "Me and you are about to have a moment." He turned and walked towards Frederick. "I'm not going to ask again, nor am I going to ask why. Frankly, at this point, I could care less now. Just hand over the bloody drive." You could hear the hurt covered by anger in Frederick's voice. "Or what? What are you going to do, lover boy?" A sly smirk spread across her matcha cheeks. "I'm not the one you have to worry about," he said, glancing over at the approaching Nathaniel. Steele, on the other hand, well, he is a dog without a government leash. Fred still had his hand out waiting for her to hand it over. Nate stood beside Fred and gave her a death glare. "Give it up," he demanded, and Selena slowly reached out and dropped the drive into Fred's hands. Selena could tell this man was different and would hurt her if needed. Nate's intimidating glare gave her a chill up her back. "I got it," JJ screamed out loud after he had been thinking hard to himself. Paige jumped and almost smacked him. The boys looked up and over at the Cajun with puzzled looks. "Selena like Selena, Kyle." JJ smiled, all proud at himself. Fred looked at Nate and then back to JJ. "Simino, if it's about a movie, TV show or some dumb song, so help me, We will have a moment. Nate pointed a finger at him. Fred handed Nate the drive, and Nate stuffed it into his pocket. He then walked past JJ and back inside the building. JJ waited till Nate had cleared to finish what he was saying. Catwoman, the thief from Batman. Her name was Selina Kyle. JJ smiled over at Paige. Paige just rolled her eyes and shook her head, as Fred was catching on to what JJ was trying to say. Fred turned and looked down at her. So like your name, our relationship was all a ruse. She stayed quiet. If you don't tell me anything, just at least tell me your real name. The woman looked down at the gravel. She knew she owed him that much after the deception. Verana. She spoke softly. Well, Verana, get up and get the bloody hell out of here before I turn you in. His voice was harsh but never raised. He then turned, not wanting to look at her. Fred knew he should have called and turned her into his supervisor, but having to see her face anymore, and the shame of letting his guard down, would break him even more than he could afford. Paige watched as the thief walked past her. Verana didn't even look at Paige nor JJ, she just walked out and disappeared. Paige tugged on JJ's sleeve as she turned and walked back towards the stairwell. JJ went to walk with her, but noticed Fred. I'm coming, JJ said as Paige nodded and walked into the stairwell. Fred kept his eyes on the horizon as Selina Verana, or whatever the hell her name was, left. His teeth grind together as he held back rage and tears. JJ knew that look all too well. He had a person betray him almost the same way. He walked over to Fred and placed a hand on his shoulder. If you need to talk, buddy, I'm here for you. JJ squeezed his shoulder a bit before backing off and letting him have time to himself. Below the apartment, Nick and Vito were still standing there waiting for the female that Kevin sent. Well, that was quite interesting. Freddy boy did have the drive. Nick's wicked smile spread across his face as he walked past Vito. Vito spun around and followed behind Nick like a guard dog. Nick picked up the phone to call his brother. It seems she has possession of the drive. The thief failed. He waited by the crosswalk across the street. Are we still going with plan? He asked, looking up at Vito. He nodded and then hung up the phone. Pack your bags, we are heading home. He slapped Vito on the back and walked across the crosswalk before the light changed, ignoring the honking and screeching cars. Vito shook his head and followed behind Nick like always, following him into danger. Back inside, Paige stopped halfway in the stairwell as her phone rang. She dug it out of her pocket and answered it quickly. Hello. She continued to walk down the stairs, but stopped when she heard the male's voice. Ms. Welsh, it was Agent Jefferson. I have been trying to call you all night. Are you all right? He asked, concerned. Yes, sir, I'm all right. She was wondering why he was calling her. I went to your apartment to speak to you and found a body. I have been calling you ever since. Jefferson explained. It is a long story, Mr. Jefferson. Paige sighed. Call me Charles, Ms. Welsh. I came across some new evidence about your father's murder. There was a pause of silence. I think a CIA agent, Kevin O'Neill, has something to do with your father's death. Ms. Welsh. She was afraid to answer. She wanted so bad to tell him everything. Her thoughts fell back on the day when she walked into the FBI office. The day she turned herself in. Paige? Paige. Jefferson's voice snapped her out of her daze. She had to tell him. She trusted him once before, when she told him of William's hand in the matter of her company, so why couldn't she trust him now? Charles, I'm in London. Kevin has Mitch and is demanding I give him a software he will kill him. It was like a small weight had been lifted off her chest. She leaned against the wall. I don't know what to do. She pressed her hand against her forehead and lowered her head. Do you have the software? He asked as he grabbed his coat and wallet from his bar. Yes, she replied. What is your exact location? I will book a flight right away. He walked out his door and speed walked to his car. No, Charles, it will just get Mitch and us killed. Paige shook her head even though he couldn't see her. No, Charles, please don't do that. Something bad will happen. She took a deep breath. She should have never told him, knowing he was going to try to help, but Paige was scared he would just make it worse. It was enough she had all these other people involved. She didn't need another person in danger. Paige, I made a promise from the beginning to help you. The agent insisted. No, Charles, please, we can handle it. Jefferson stopped halfway into his car. Who? Nate. Is he with you? Paige, he is dangerous. He will get you killed. He slammed his car door and started up the car. Charles, please, they were far from last name bases at this point. Nathaniel, Frederick and Johnny, we have things under control. She stood up and said with a sterner voice. Frederick. Why did that ring a bell in Charles's memory? Frederick. Frederick who? He asked. Harrison. Look, I have to go. I will call you back if I can, okay? Don't worry, I will be fine. Paige had said too much and hung up quickly. Charles cursed as she hung up. He was on the highway at this point. He tried to call the office and not wreck as he fumbled with the keypad on the phone. He was finally able to get a hold of someone. Hello. Yes, this is Agent Jefferson. I need all the information on a Frederick Harrison. It should be in the Welsh's file. He took the exit off the highway to head towards the airport. Paige walked into Fred's apartment with a frown and a sad look on her face. JJ sat up and looked over at her. Are you okay? He asked, concerned. Nate was standing up in the corner holding the drive in one hand and the phone in the other. He turned around when he heard JJ speak and glanced over at Paige. Where's Fred? Paige asked the two. Probably still on the roof, poor guy. Johnny looked down at the floor and shook his head. Where were you? Nate asked, more like demanded. Paige perked up her head at Nate's tone. I was out strolling the town, you know, caught a movie and had a date, she answered sarcastically, crossing her arms. Nate glared at her. I don't need your smart remarks. He snapped back. And I don't need you asking me stupid questions like you are my father or something. JJ just looked back and forth at the two. It's my job to keep you safe, remember? He snapped back. As I remember, your job was finished. I had enough of the control from my father, I don't need it from you. Paige growled. Nate took a step closer towards her. Oh, poor pitiful rich girl, had to actually do some work. Nate shook his head. Have everything you want and being waited on hand and foot, won't get that from me. He spat. My life was not waited on hand and foot. My father demanded perfection. It was not all rainbows and puppies. He was strict and was barely home. And when he was there, he demanded perfection, control of my every move and future. It wasn't the luxurious lifestyle as you think. She didn't know why she was even arguing with Nate. He was stubborn, but she knew how to get under his skin. Last I looked, I was the one who saved you. Remember the warehouse, or did you forget? She stood her ground. As I remember, you wouldn't know any of that if it wasn't for me. Nate took a couple steps closer. This isn't your company and I'm not your employee. You are not my boss. Before Nate could continue, Paige snapped back and bucked up to him. No. You are not, and I know that, but you offered to help me, not oversee me. She started to almost scream now. Nate's blood started to boil. Yeah, and how the hell can I help you when you won't listen to me, huh? He screamed back and JJ had enough. He jumped between the two and pushed them back. Nate grabbed JJ's hand and threw it off him. Calm down, Nate, JJ said, turning to face him. No, and stay out of this. He pointed a finger at him. No. No, I won't. For one, you don't need to be yelling at her like that, and for two, Nate stepped in his face. You know nothing of her, so back off, Simone. He growled. No. And I don't know her, but I know she doesn't need to be talked to like that, JJ glared. And what would you know? Huh, Cajun. You're always in Lala TV land to know anything. JJ grew pissed. I'm about tired of everyone thinking I'm an idiot. Just cause I'm not a stone cold, stick up my butt bastard doesn't mean I'm slow or stupid. Unlike you, I have feelings for people and can connect with them. Nate snickered at that. Says the one who blows up innocent people, and who couldn't even help your brother. And before the last word left his lips, JJ cocked back and decked Nate in the face. Nate stumbled back a bit and then lunged at Johnny. Fists were flying as their bodies entangled in a fight. Paige was screaming for them to stop, but they ignored her. The two tore up Fred's apartment as they fought all over. Fred finally walked in the door to see the chaos that was stewing in his home. "Hey!" His deep voice bellowed. He was quick to act as he jumped in to break them apart. Paige just stepped back and threw her hands in the air. She didn't care anymore. She looked down and the drive was on the carpet of the rug. Paige bent down to pick it up and then sat on the couch. She stared at the small plastic device, wondering why so much trouble over the smallest thing. Even the smallest thing could have the biggest impact on people's life. This drive had so much impact on her life and was making it hell. She looked up at the others as they fought. It wasn't just her life, but everyone around her. Somehow she needed to destroy this thing. She couldn't allow this thing to affect others the way it was doing to her or her friends. Fred finally broke the two apart and placed a hand on each of their chests. "This is bloody ridiculous. You Americans, you should know the meaning behind a house divided." He spoke harshly, almost out of breath from the scuffle. Nate said nothing and just glared at JJ. For once, Johnny kept his mouth shut as well. He was furious at Nate. He couldn't believe how he was acting. Nate pushed Fred's hand off his chest and walked out the door, slamming it. Paige watched him and shook her head. "I will go after him." Fred sighed. He went to walk out and Paige jumped up. "No. Let him go. He wants to act like a child. I don't need him. I'm done with his bull crap." Fred turned and looked at her. "I know you are upset, but Paige, we need everyone, if we are to go against these people." Paige rolled her eyes and looked away. Johnny checked to see if his nose was bleeding or not, and then went to sit on the couch. "Nate thinks he can run everything, and he is Mr. Hotshot." He glared at the closed door that Nate slammed. "If he can't work with us, then screw him." Fred sighed and shook his head. He knew the type of people they were against. He knew they didn't stand a chance without help.